The rain was coming down hard that night in February 1937, the kind of rain that turns dirt roads into rivers of red Mississippi clay and makes you question whether you should be traveling at all. The kind of rain that sounds like 1,000 fingers drumming on tin roofs, that turns the world into a blur of water and darkness, that makes even the bravest souls want to stay home by the fire. But the midnight train from Clarksdale to Memphis didn't wait for weather. It never did. The Southern Railroad kept its schedule regardless of rain or shine, storm or calm, because in the Depression-era South, the trains were lifelines, and lifelines didn't stop for anything. And on that particular night, in the third car from the engine, something happened that 30 witnesses would carry with them until their dying days. Something that would haunt their dreams and color their memories. Something that made grown men whisper prayers in the darkness and women clutch their crosses so tight their knuckles turned white. Something that would be talked about in hushed voices in juke joints and churches, in kitchens and on front porches for decades to come. Because that was the night Robert Johnson stepped onto that train car with his battered guitar case, tipped his hat to no one in particular, and proceeded to play the most beautiful, terrifying music anyone had ever heard. And he did it all with his eyes completely closed. Not just closed, sealed shut, pressed together as if by some invisible force. As if he was seeing something the rest of them couldn't. Or perhaps, as some would later swear on their mothers' graves, as if he didn't want to see what was looking back at him. As if keeping his eyes open would reveal something too terrible to witness, as if the darkness behind his eyelids was preferable to whatever stood before him in that rattling train car. This is Soul Chronicles, where we dig deep into the shadows of blues history, into the stories that time tried to bury, but the music kept alive, into the moments that define legends and the legends that defined an entire genre of music. I'm your guide through these forgotten roads, through these abandoned train stations, through these memories that refuse to die no matter how many years pass. And tonight, we're boarding that train, we're sitting in that car, we're feeling the cold rain against the windows and the rhythm of the rails beneath our feet. We're watching what those 30 passengers watched, and we're trying to understand what it meant when a man could play like an angel while looking like he was staring straight into the abyss. What it meant when genius and darkness became so intertwined that you couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. What it meant when music stopped being entertainment and became something closer to prayer or confession or perhaps even damnation. Before we pull out of the station, if you want to ride along on more journeys like this one, if you want to hear the stories that hide between the notes and behind the legends, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. Because here at Soul Chronicles, every story is a door, and some doors lead to places you never knew existed. Drop a comment telling me which blues legend you want me to uncover next, because in this world, every soul has a song. And every song has a secret. The Southern Railroad line between Clarksdale and Memphis was a lifeline in the 1930s, a ribbon of steel cutting through cotton fields and pine forests, through towns that didn't welcome black travelers after dark, through a landscape of beauty and brutality in equal measure. For black musicians, it was more than that. It was more than transportation. It was a highway of dreams, a pathway to possibility, a ribbon of steel that connected the cotton fields of Mississippi to the recording studios and juke joints of Tennessee. It was freedom, in a way. Freedom to move, freedom to pursue music, freedom to escape, even temporarily, the crushing weight of Jim Crow and sharecropping and a world that seemed designed to keep them in their place. Robert Johnson had ridden that line many times before. He knew every stop, every curve, every crossing. He knew which towns were safe to get off in and which ones weren't. He knew where the good juke joints were, where a traveling musician could find a hot meal and a place to sleep, where the money was good and the crowds were hungry for music. But this night was different. Anyone watching him board could see that. This night he wasn't running towards something. He was running away from it, running from what exactly no one could say. But the look in his eyes as he stepped onto that platform, the way he kept glancing over his shoulder, the way his hand gripped that guitar case like it was the only solid thing in a world that had gone liquid and unstable, all of it suggested a man being pursued, being chased by something that couldn't be outrun, but had to be fled from anyway. The passengers who boarded that train in Clarksdale were the usual mixture of humanity you'd find on any late-night Southern Railroad journey. Laborers heading north for work, their hands calloused and strong, their backs bent from years in the cotton fields, families visiting relatives, children sleeping against their mothers' shoulders, bundled against the February cold. A few gamblers with sharp eyes and sharper smiles, cards hidden in their jacket pockets, a few drifters who seemed to have no destination in particular, just moving because staying still felt more dangerous, a preacher with a worn Bible, its leather cover soft from 1,000 readings, its pages marked with notes and underlines, and the accumulated wisdom of a life spent trying to save souls. And musicians. There were always musicians on that train, men with guitars strapped to their backs like extra limbs, harmonicas in their pockets that they'd pull out to blow a few notes when the mood struck. Men with songs in their heads and calloused fingers and dreams of making it big in Memphis or Chicago or anywhere that wasn't here. The third car was known as the music car, though no official designation said so. No sign on the door, no announcement from the conductor. It was just understood, an unspoken agreement among those who traveled the line regularly. If you wanted to play, if you wanted to sing, if you wanted to pass the long night with something other than silence and the rhythm of the rails, you went to the third car. And if you wanted to sleep, if you wanted quiet, if you wanted to be left alone with your thoughts, you went anywhere else. The music car was a sacred space in its way, a place where the rules of the outside world were suspended temporarily, where black musicians could create and compete and collaborate without worrying about who was watching, without having to bow and scrape and play the roles society demanded of them. In the music car, at least for a few hours, they were free. Free to be artists, free to be themselves. Robert Johnson stepped onto the platform at Clarksdale Station at 11:45. The rain had momentarily slowed to a drizzle, and the platform lights created halos in the moisture-thick air. He was alone. Several witnesses would later recall that detail with an odd insistence, with an emphasis that seemed disproportionate to its importance. Alone, completely alone. As if they expected someone to be with him, as if someone should have been with him. As if a man like that, with a presence like that, shouldn't be walking unaccompanied through the Mississippi night. He wore a dark suit that had seen better days, the kind of suit a man might wear to church on Sunday if he had only one good suit and wanted to make it last. The fabric was worn at the elbows and knees, shiny in places from use, but clean and carefully maintained. A hat pulled low over his eyes, the brim shadowing his face, making it difficult to make out his features in the dim station light. And he carried that guitar case like it weighed more than it should. Not struggling under its weight exactly, but carrying it with a deliberateness, a care that suggested this was more than just an instrument, like it was full of something heavier than wood and strings, like it contained something precious and dangerous in equal measure, like dropping it might release something that couldn't be contained again. He didn't speak to anyone as he boarded, didn't nod, didn't smile, didn't make eye contact. He just moved through the car with a kind of focused intention, as if he knew exactly where he needed to be and couldn't afford to be distracted. He found a seat near the back of the third car, in the corner where the shadows were deepest, where the light from the overhead lamps didn't quite reach. He placed the guitar case carefully on his lap, both hands resting on it, protective. And then he stared out the rain-streaked window as the train lurched into motion with a groan of metal and steam. The whistle blew, long and mournful, the kind of sound that carries across fields and into souls, the kind of sound that makes you think about journeys and destinations and all the miles in between. The train began to move, slowly at first, then gathering speed, the rhythm of the wheels on the tracks creating a steady percussion that every musician on that car felt in their bones. Clickety-clack, 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 the heartbeat of the railroad, the pulse of motion. For the first 20 minutes, Robert Johnson was just another passenger, quiet, still, unremarkable in his stillness. The music car was filling with sound around him. Someone was already playing a slow 12-bar progression, the kind of basic blues structure that every musician knows by heart. Another man was tapping out rhythms on the back of a seat with his palms, syncopated beats that complemented the train's steady pulse. Two women in the corner were humming harmony, their voices blending and separating like water flowing around rocks. The preacher had even hummed along for a moment before catching himself, remembering perhaps that church music and devil's music weren't supposed to mix, weren't supposed to touch, even though they came from the same source, the same deep well of human emotion and spiritual longing. But then someone asked the question that changed everything, the question that set the night in motion, the question that 30 people would remember for the rest of their lives as the moment before. A young man named Thomas Crawford, barely 20 years old, with smooth hands that hadn't yet developed the calluses of a real working musician, but would soon enough. He was carrying his own guitar and was full of the kind of confidence that comes before the world teaches you humility, before you learn that talent alone isn't enough, before you understand that some mountains can't be climbed no matter how hard you try. He'd been watching Robert for those first 20 minutes, studying him with the intensity of a young musician trying to measure himself against the competition. And he didn't like being ignored. Didn't like the way this stranger had walked in and sat in the corner without acknowledging anyone, without joining in, without even seeming to notice that he was in the music car. So Thomas looked over at Robert, made sure he had the attention of others around him, and said loud enough for half the car to hear, his voice carrying that particular kind of bravado that young men use when they're trying to impress. "You play that thing, mister? Or you just carry it for show? Because we got actual musicians here, and we don't have time for folks who just like the look of having a guitar." It wasn't meant as an insult exactly, or maybe it was. Maybe it was both. An invitation and a challenge, a welcome and a test. The language musicians speak to each other, particularly young musicians who haven't yet learned that music isn't about competition, it's about communion. Robert didn't answer right away. He just kept looking out that window, watching the darkness rush past, watching the rain trace patterns on the glass like some kind of code, some kind of message written in water. The reflections of the interior lights created ghost images on the window, so that Robert seemed to be surrounded by phantoms, by pale copies of the other passengers floating in the darkness outside. For a moment it seemed like he hadn't heard, like Thomas's challenge had simply dissolved into the air, unanswered and unacknowledged. Then slowly, without looking at Thomas, without looking at anyone, without shifting his gaze from that rain-streaked window, he spoke. His voice was quiet, but it carried. It had a quality to it that made everyone in that car stop what they were doing and listen, made the other musicians stop playing mid-chord, made the women stop humming, made conversations die mid-sentence. It wasn't loud, it wasn't forceful, but it commanded attention in a way that shouting never could. "I play," he said, "but I don't know if you want to hear it. I don't know if you're ready to hear it." There was something in the way he said it. A warning, a weariness, a resignation, as if the music he carried wasn't entertainment, as if it wasn't something to be shared lightly, as if it was something else entirely, something that had weight, something that had cost, something that, once released, couldn't be easily contained again. But Thomas Crawford was young and eager, and he didn't hear the warning. Or maybe he heard it and dismissed it, the way young people dismiss warnings, thinking they're immune, thinking they're different, thinking that consequences are things that happen to other people. "Come on, man," he said, grinning that easy grin of youth, that smile that hasn't yet been taught about regret or consequences, or the weight of watching something you can't unsee. "We got a long ride ahead. Let's hear what you got. Show us what that guitar can do." Others murmured agreement. The car was full of people hungry for distraction, for beauty, for anything to make the night pass faster, to make the miles feel shorter, to forget for a moment the hardness of their lives and the uncertainty of their futures. So Robert Johnson opened that guitar case, and that's when people started paying attention, really paying attention, because the guitar that emerged from that case was unlike any instrument most of them had ever seen. It was old. That much was clear immediately. Ancient, even. The wood was dark, almost black in the dim light of the train car, as if it had been stained not by varnish, but by time itself, by all the nights it had played, by all the hands that had held it. The finish was worn in places, polished smooth by contact, as if 1,000 hands had held it, as if it had played 1,000 nights in 1,000 forgotten juke joints and crossroads and places that existed more in memory than in geography. But there was something else, something that made people lean forward slightly, made them squint, made them try to understand what they were seeing. Something about the way the guitar seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it, as if the wood was drinking in the illumination from the overhead lamps and giving nothing back, as if it existed in its own pocket of darkness, even in a lit space. Something about the way Robert held it, not with love or pride or the casual familiarity of a musician with a favorite instrument, but with a kind of careful respect, the way you'd hold something dangerous, something that might bite if you weren't careful, something that tolerated you rather than belonged to you. He tuned it slowly, methodically, his fingers moving over the strings with a precision that suggested this wasn't just preparation, but ritual. Each string was adjusted with care, plucked and listened to, and adjusted again until the tone was exactly right. Not just in tune, but perfectly in tune, with a precision that suggested he was hearing harmonics that others couldn't, finding exact pitches in a way that went beyond normal musical training. The sound of the tuning filled the car, pure notes that rang out clear, despite the rattle of the train and the drum of rain on the roof. And with each note, the attention in the car grew more focused, more intense, until it felt like every eye was on him, every ear tuned to what he was doing. And here's where the strangeness began. Here's where the story stops being about a man playing guitar on a train and becomes something else. Something that 30 people would struggle to explain for the rest of their lives. Something that would make them question what they saw, what they heard, what they believed about the nature of reality and possibility, and the thin line between the natural and the supernatural. Because as Robert Johnson began to play, as his fingers found the first chord and his voice rose to meet it, his eyes closed, not gradually. Not the way a musician might close their eyes to focus or feel the music more deeply, that natural tendency to shut out visual distractions and sink into sound. They closed like shutters slamming, like doors locking, like something being sealed away. One moment his eyes were open, fixed on some middle distance, seeing nothing in particular. The next moment they were shut tight, the lids pressed together with such force that the muscles around his eyes tensed visibly, creating lines and shadows on his face that made him look older, more careworn, more burdened than he had just seconds before. And they didn't open again for the next 45 minutes, not once, not even a flutter, not even when he turned his head, not even when he adjusted his position, not even when he reached for different frets or changed his strumming pattern. His eyes remained closed as if glued shut, as if he'd forgotten how to open them, as if opening them was not an option. As if whatever he was seeing behind those closed lids was the only reality that mattered. The first song was Crossroad Blues, Of course it was. Those who knew the song recognized it immediately, recognized the opening notes, the descending bass line, the particular way Robert's voice cracked on certain syllables, as if the words themselves were too heavy to carry smoothly. But this wasn't the version that would later be immortalized on scratchy recordings in a San Antonio hotel room. This wasn't the version that would be analyzed by musicologists and covered by rock bands and taught in university courses on American music. This was different, rawer, more desperate, more immediate, like the difference between reading about fire and putting your hand in the flame. The lyrics were the same, the melody recognizable to anyone who knew the blues, but there was an urgency to it, a darkness that seemed to seep from every note, to pour from Robert's voice like blood from a wound. And his voice, already haunting on his recordings, already possessing that particular quality that made you feel like you were hearing something you shouldn't, took on dimensions in that train car that the recordings could never capture. It sounded like he was singing from somewhere far away, like the voice was traveling through him rather than coming from him. Like he was a conduit, a channel, a hollow reed that sound was flowing through from some other place, some other realm, some other dimension where music was more than organized noise, where it was something alive, something with will and purpose and intention. But it was his playing that truly unsettled them. With his eyes sealed shut, pressing together so hard that witnesses could see the tremor of tension in his facial muscles, Robert's fingers moved across that guitar with impossible accuracy. Not just accuracy, beyond accuracy, virtuosity that seemed to transcend human limitation. He played runs and riffs that seemed to require sight, that seemed to demand the musician watch their own hands to execute. Complex fingering patterns that professional guitarists would need to practice for hours just to approximate. Lightning-fast hammer-ons and pull-offs that blurred together into cascades of notes, each one perfectly placed, perfectly timed, perfectly executed. But Robert never looked, never wavered, never missed a note, never hesitated. His hands moved like they belonged to someone else, like they were being guided by invisible strings, like he was a puppet and something else was the puppeteer, moving his fingers with a precision and speed that his own will couldn't command. Several witnesses would later use that exact phrase when trying to describe what they saw. Guided. As if someone or something was showing him where to put his fingers, moving his hands across the fretboard with a choreographer's precision. As if he was channeling rather than creating, receiving rather than generating. An older woman named Sarah Mitchell, who had played piano in her church for 30 years, who had trained classically as a girl before circumstances forced her into a different life, who understood music theory and composition and all the technical aspects of performance, would tell her family that watching Robert play was like watching someone possessed. But possessed by what? Her daughter asked, her voice small and frightened, not sure she wanted the answer. Sarah never answered that question directly. She just looked out the window of her small house, looked at nothing in particular, and said quietly, "By whatever lives in the music, by whatever the music lives in, by whatever made the first person pick up an instrument and realize they could make sounds that moved the soul, that's what possessed him, and I don't think it asked permission first." Thomas Crawford, the young man who had challenged Robert to play, who had been so confident just minutes before, sat frozen in his seat, his own guitar forgotten on his lap, forgotten as completely as if it had never existed. His hands, which had been so eager to show off his own skills, lay limp and useless in his lap. His mouth hung slightly open, not in an exaggerated expression of shock, but in the natural slackness that comes when you forget you have a face. When your conscious mind is so overwhelmed by what you're witnessing that it forgets to maintain the usual controls over your expression. Years later, in an interview recorded by a folklore student in 1968, when Thomas was an old man with arthritis in his hands and dust in his lungs and a lifetime of music behind him, He would say, his voice shaking, not with age, but with the memory, "I've seen a lot of guitar players in my life, seen men who could make that instrument sing, cry, laugh, pray, seen fingers move so fast they blurred, seen performances that brought audiences to tears, or to their feet, or to their knees. But I never seen anyone play like that. Not before that night. Not since that night. Not in 40 years of playing music and watching others play it. It was like the guitar was playing him, instead of the other way around, like he was just the vessel and the music was pouring through him from somewhere else. From somewhere dark, from somewhere that doesn't have a name. And the worst part, the part that still wakes me up sometimes in the middle of the night, was that I could see it was hurting him, could see that whatever was flowing through him was burning him from the inside. But he couldn't stop, wouldn't stop, like stopping would be worse than enduring it. After Crossroad Blues, Robert didn't pause, didn't open his eyes, didn't acknowledge the stunned silence that had fallen over the car like a heavy blanket, smothering conversation, smothering even thought. Didn't take a breath that anyone could see. He just transitioned seamlessly into another song, the chords flowing from one to the other, as if they were all part of one long, continuous piece, one endless musical statement that had no beginning and would have no end. Hellhound on my trail. And if Crossroad Blues had been unsettling, if it had created an atmosphere of unease in that rattling train car, this was something else entirely. This was terror translated into melody, fear given voice and rhythm and structure, paranoia crystallized into chord progressions. The lyrics spoke of being followed, hunted, pursued by something relentless and inhuman, something that never tired, never stopped, never gave up the chase. And the way Robert sang them, eyes still closed, face expressionless as a death mask, suggested he wasn't singing about metaphors. He wasn't using the hellhound as a symbol for depression or heartbreak or bad luck. He was singing about reality, about something actual, about something that was, at that very moment, on his trail. The rain outside intensified, hammering against the windows with a fury that seemed to match the music. To be driven by the music, to be part of the music. Lightning flickered in the distance, brief white flashes that illuminated the car for split seconds at a time, freezing everyone in tableaus of fear and fascination. The thunder that followed rolled long and low, felt as much as heard, vibrating through the floor of the train car, through the seats, through the bones of everyone inside. And in those flashes, in those brief moments of stark illumination before darkness slammed back down, several passengers would later claim they saw something that couldn't be explained by any rational means, something that violated the natural laws they thought they understood. They saw Robert's shadow on the wall behind him, cast by the overhead lamps and extended by the lightning flashes. But it wasn't moving the way shadows should. It wasn't matching his movements. When Robert swayed slightly with the rhythm of his playing, the shadow remained still. When Robert's hands moved across the fretboard, the shadow's arms seemed to move in different directions, tracing patterns that made no geometric sense. It seemed to move independently, seemed to sway and shift in ways that had nothing to do with the light source or Robert's position. Several people rubbed their eyes, looked away and looked back, trying to reset their vision, trying to convince themselves they were seeing things that weren't there. But the shadow persisted in its wrongness, in its impossible behavior. A man named James Booker, a railroad worker heading home after a long shift, a practical man who dealt in steel and steam and the concrete realities of machinery, leaned over to his wife and whispered, his voice hoarse with an emotion he couldn't name, "Do you see that? Do you see the shadow?" She nodded, her face pale in the dim light, her hands gripping his arm so tight he'd have bruises the next day. They weren't the only ones. At least 6 other passengers would mention the shadow in later accounts, would bring it up unprompted when asked to describe the night, as if it was the detail that haunted them most, the thing that proved what they'd witnessed went beyond unusual and into the realm of the impossible. Some said it looked like there were two shadows instead of one, overlapping but not quite aligned, as if Robert was being shadowed by something that occupied almost but not quite the same space he did. Others said the shadow seemed darker than it should be, darker than the normal absence of light, as if it was pulling illumination into itself, as if it was a hole in reality rather than just a dark spot on a wall. One woman, refusing to give her name to the folklore student who interviewed her decades later, her voice shaking even after all those years, said the shadow had eyes. "I know how that sounds," she said, her hands trembling as she lifted a cup of coffee to her lips. "I know people will think I'm crazy, will think I imagined it or made it up for attention or was just scared and seeing things that weren't there. But I saw what I saw. That shadow was looking at us, looking at him, looking at Robert like it owned him. And whatever it was, whatever cast that shadow, it wasn't natural. It wasn't right. And the worst part was that Robert seemed to know it was there. Even with his eyes closed, even with his face blank as stone, I could tell he knew. Could tell he felt it watching. Could tell it was the reason his eyes were closed in the first place. Because if he opened them, he'd have to see it. And seeing it would be worse than anything else. Robert played for 45 minutes straight. 45 minutes without pause, without rest, without water, without once opening his eyes or seeming to need to. 45 minutes that felt like both an instant and an eternity, that bent time in ways that left passengers confused about how long they'd actually been on that train, how far they'd traveled, whether they were even still in the same reality they'd boarded in. He cycled through songs that wouldn't be recorded for months, songs that wouldn't be heard by the wider world until decades later, songs that some of the musicians in that car recognized because they traveled the same circuits, played the same juke joints, knew the same repertoire. Me and the Devil Blues, Stones in My Passway, Traveling Riverside Blues, each one more intense than the last. Each one seeming to pull something from the air, from the rain, from the darkness outside the rattling windows. Each one adding another layer to the atmosphere in that car, building and building until it felt like the air itself was thick, hard to breathe, charged with something that made the hair on people's arms stand up and their skin prickle with goosebumps despite the warmth of the crowded space. And here's what made it truly extraordinary, what separated this from any other musical performance anyone in that car had ever witnessed or would witness again. Here's what made those 30 passengers remember that night with crystal clarity for the rest of their lives, made it the story they told and retold, the night that divided their lives into before and after. Robert wasn't just playing music, he was telling a story. A story that had chapters and plot and character development. With his eyes closed, unable to see his audience, unable to gauge their reactions through normal visual cues, unable to read faces or body language or any of the normal feedback a performer uses to adjust their performance, he was somehow responding to them. Responding to their emotional states, to their levels of fear and fascination, to the exact amount of tension they could bear before it became too much. When the fear in the car grew too thick, too heavy, when people started shifting in their seats uncomfortably, when some began to consider leaving despite the rain and the late hour and the danger of being caught between cars on a moving train, he would shift into something gentler, something that released the tension just enough to let people breathe. A brief instrumental passage that was almost pretty, almost soothing, that gave the illusion of safety and normalcy. When that relief settled in, when people started to relax, when their shoulders came down from their ears and their breathing deepened and they thought maybe the worst was over, he would plunge back into darkness, into songs that spoke of bargains and consequences, of roads that led nowhere good, of debts that could never be fully paid, of hounds that never stopped hunting, of shadows that never stopped watching. It was masterful, it was manipulative, it was terrifying. Sarah Mitchell would later say it felt like Robert was a preacher and they were his congregation. But instead of salvation, instead of the promise of heaven and redemption and washing away sins in the blood of the Lamb, he was offering them a glimpse into damnation. A tour of hell, conducted by someone who'd been there, who lived there, who couldn't leave no matter how much he wanted to. He was showing us the cost, she said, her voice quiet but firm, sitting in her small kitchen 30 years later, her piano visible through the doorway, silent and patient. The cost of genius, the cost of wanting something so bad you'd trade anything for it. The cost of making deals in the dark with things that don't have your best interests at heart. And with his eyes closed like that, it was like he couldn't bear to see what he'd become, couldn't stand to look at himself, at us, at the world he was trapped in. Or maybe he was seeing something else, something we couldn't see, something behind his eyelids that was more real than anything in front of them. Something he wished he couldn't see either. Something that was always there, always watching, always reminding him of the price he paid and the debt he still owed. I pray every night that I never know what he saw. I pray that whatever door he opened, it stays closed for me and mine. The train clattered through small towns, barely visible in the rain and darkness, past dark fields where cotton waited to be picked and lives waited to be lived, across bridges that shuddered under the weight of steel and steam and human cargo, bridges over rivers swollen with February rain, rivers that looked black and endless in the night. Outside, the world was a blur of rain and night, and occasional lights that appeared and disappeared like fireflies. Farmhouses and crossroads, and places where people lived lives that would never touch what was happening in that third car. Inside the third car, time seemed to stretch and compress simultaneously, to behave in ways that defied normal understanding. Minutes felt like hours, each second elongated by the intensity of what they were witnessing, by the fear and fascination that held them motionless. Hours felt like seconds, the performance seeming to pass in an instant even as it went on and on. The only constant was the music. The only anchor was Robert's voice, and those relentless fingers dancing across strings they couldn't see, moving with a precision and speed that seemed to defy human limitation. Thomas Crawford later said he tried to study Robert's technique, tried to understand how he was doing what he was doing, but he couldn't focus. Every time I tried to watch his hands, to break it down, to learn from it, my attention would slip, he recalled. It was like trying to hold water, like trying to remember a dream. I'd be watching his fingers 1 second, and the next, I'd be lost in the sound, in the feeling, and by the time I shook myself out of it and tried to look again, he'd be doing something completely different, something that shouldn't have been possible. Around the 20-minute mark, when the storm outside was at its worst and the music inside was at its darkest, something happened that would become the most discussed aspect of the entire event, the detail that witnesses would return to again and again, the image that would appear in their dreams for years afterward. Robert was in the middle of a song, his voice low and mournful, the guitar weeping beneath his fingers, and suddenly, inexplicably, tears began rolling down his closed eyes. Not the tears of someone crying in the normal sense. He wasn't sobbing, wasn't sniffling, wasn't making any of the usual sounds or movements that accompany weeping. His face remained completely expressionless, still as stone, still as death, frozen in that same blank mask he'd worn since his eyes first closed. His breathing didn't change. His singing didn't falter. But tears streamed down his cheeks, steady and silent, catching the light from the overhead lamps, creating gleaming trails on his dark skin, dripping from his jaw onto his shirt collar, onto the guitar, onto his hands. They seemed to come from nowhere, from some deep internal well that had nothing to do with emotion in the normal sense, as if they were being pulled from him by some external force, as if grief itself had reached inside him and was wringing him out like a wet cloth, as if sorrow was a physical thing that could be extracted, distilled, made visible. The tears fell and fell, never slowing, never stopping, an impossible amount of moisture from eyes that remained sealed shut. It was unnatural. It was disturbing. It was one of the saddest things anyone in that car had ever witnessed. Several passengers gasped audibly, the sound sharp in the close air of the train car. The preacher, who had been sitting quietly in a corner, gripping his Bible with white knuckles, watching with the horrified fascination of someone witnessing something his theology couldn't quite account for, suddenly stood. His legs seemed to move of their own accord, propelling him to his feet as if his body had decided action was necessary, even if his mind couldn't determine what action that should be. He began reciting the 23rd Psalm under his breath, the words tumbling out in a whisper. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures." Over and over, a prayer or a shield or perhaps both, the familiar words a bulwark against something that felt ancient and powerful and not entirely of this world. A young mother covered her children's eyes with her hands, turned their faces into her shoulder, though they hadn't asked to look away, though they had been sleeping peacefully until her sudden movement startled them awake. She held them tight, rocking slightly, humming a different tune entirely, something soft and sweet, trying to drown out what Robert was playing, trying to protect them from something she couldn't name, but knew in her bones was dangerous. Dangerous not to the body, but to something deeper, something that couldn't be protected with physical shields. And through it all, Robert kept playing, kept singing, eyes closed, tears falling like rain down his face, soaking into his collar, darkening the fabric of his shirt, fingers never faltering, never losing the rhythm, never missing a note. As if the tears and the music came from different sources, as if his body was divided into sections that operated independently, as if he was many people occupying one space, one playing guitar with inhuman skill, another weeping with inhuman sorrow, another singing with inhuman passion, all of them trapped together in that single form. "It was the saddest thing I ever saw," Sarah Mitchell recalled. "Not sad like heartbreak or loss, sad like witnessing something that can't be undone, sad like watching someone carry a burden so heavy it's crushing them, but they can't put it down because if they do, something worse will happen. I wanted to tell him to stop. I wanted to cover my ears, but I couldn't move. None of us could. We were transfixed. The train crossed into Tennessee. The rain began to ease. And finally, after 45 minutes that felt like a lifetime, Robert Johnson played his last note. It hung in the air of that train car, sustaining longer than it should have, resonating in a way that made the windows vibrate slightly. And then silence. Complete, absolute silence. Not even the sound of breathing. Not even the sound of the rain or the rails. Just silence that pressed down on everyone like a physical weight. And then Robert opened his eyes. That's what everyone remembered most vividly, the moment when his eyes opened. Because for just a fraction of a second, just long enough for several people to see it clearly but too quick for anyone to be completely certain, his eyes weren't the eyes he'd had when he boarded the train. They were different, darker, emptier, or perhaps fuller, filled with something that shouldn't be there. It was like looking into a well, James Booker would say years later. A well with no bottom, a well that went down forever. And for that split second I felt like if I kept looking I'd fall in. But then he blinked and his eyes were normal again. Tired, human, sad in a way that was recognizable. And Robert Johnson, without a word, carefully placed his guitar back in its case, closed it, and returned to staring out the window. As if nothing had happened, as if he hadn't just held 30 people spellbound for 3/4 of an hour, as if he hadn't just demonstrated mastery of an instrument without the benefit of sight, as if tears hadn't rolled down his face from closed eyes while singing about devils and crossroads and hellhounds. For a long moment, no one spoke, no one knew what to say. How do you respond to something like that? How do you acknowledge what you've witnessed when you're not entirely sure what it was you witnessed? Finally, the preacher cleared his throat. "Young man," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "Where did you learn to play like that?" Robert didn't turn from the window, didn't look at the preacher or anyone else. He just said very quietly, "I didn't learn it, it learned me." That phrase would haunt several of the passengers. It learned me, not I learned it. As if the music was the teacher and Robert was the student. As if the process hadn't been acquisition, but submission. As if he hadn't mastered the guitar, but had allowed himself to be mastered by it. Thomas Crawford asked, emboldened by youth and curiosity, "Why did you keep your eyes closed?" This time Robert did turn. He looked at Thomas, and there was something in his gaze that made the younger man wish he hadn't asked. "Because," Robert said slowly, "some things play better in the dark, and some things you're better off not seeing while they're happening." The train pulled into Memphis at 1:30 in the morning. The rain had stopped completely. The station was mostly empty at that hour, just a few workers and late-night travelers. Robert Johnson was the first to stand, the first to gather his belongings, the first to head for the door. As he passed Thomas Crawford, the young man gathered his courage one more time. "Will you teach me?" he asked. "Will you show me how you do it?" Robert stopped. He stood there for a long moment, guitar case in hand, hat shadowing his face. When he spoke, his voice was barely audible. "No," he said, "you don't want to learn this. You think you do, but you don't. This kind of playing, it costs more than you'd think, more than anyone should pay." And then he was gone, disappearing into the Memphis night like a shadow dissolving into darkness. The 30 passengers who had watched him play filed off the train. Each of them changed in ways they couldn't quite articulate. Changed in ways they wouldn't fully understand until years later, when Robert Johnson's recordings would circulate, when his legend would grow, when people would argue about whether he actually sold his soul to the devil at a crossroads. Changed because they had seen something that night that confirmed what some of them had always suspected. That music, real music, deep music, isn't just entertainment, it's a doorway. And what walks through that doorway doesn't always walk back out. In the days and weeks that followed, those passengers would try to tell others what they'd witnessed, but the stories always fell flat in the retelling. How do you explain that kind of intensity to someone who wasn't there? How do you convey the feeling of watching someone play an instrument they couldn't see, guided by something invisible, crying tears from closed eyes, casting shadows that moved wrong? Most of them eventually stopped trying. They kept the memory to themselves, took it out occasionally like a treasured photograph, examined it in private and put it away again. But they never forgot. Sarah Mitchell kept playing piano in her church for another 30 years, but she would sometimes pause in the middle of a hymn, her hands hovering over the keys, and people knew she was remembering that night. Thomas Crawford became a respected bluesman in his own right, played clubs throughout the South, recorded a few songs that historians would later praise. But he never kept his eyes closed while he played. Never. When asked why, he'd just shake his head and say, "Some doors are better left shut." James Booker told his children about it when they were old enough to understand, or at least old enough to listen. "Your daddy saw something on a train once," he'd say, "saw a man make a deal visible, saw the cost of genius written on a face. And I've never been sure whether I was blessed or cursed to witness it." When his youngest daughter asked what he meant, he just said, "Some folks are touched by greatness, others are touched by something else." Robert Johnson was touched by both. And that night, we all felt the touch. The preacher, whose name was recorded as Reverend Micah Stone, incorporated the experience into his sermons. Though he never mentioned Robert by name, he would speak of men who walked with darkness, of talents that came with prices, of gifts that were also curses. "The devil doesn't come with horns and a pitchfork," he would preach. "He comes with what you want most, and he delivers. Oh, he delivers, but what he takes in return, what he asks for, that's the part they don't tell you about until it's too late, until your eyes are closed and you can't see what you've become." 17 months after that night on the train, Robert Johnson was dead. poisoned, most accounts say, by a jealous husband who slipped strychnine into his whiskey at a juke joint in Mississippi. He was 27 years old. In his brief life, he recorded 29 songs. 29 songs that would influence generations of musicians, that would become the foundation of rock and roll, that would be studied and analyzed and copied and revered. 29 songs that captured something essential and terrifying about the human condition, about desire and consequence, about the places where talent meets desperation. But the recordings, as powerful as they are just echoes of what Robert Johnson could do, shadows of the real thing. The 30 passengers who saw him play that night in the third car of a train from Clarksdale to Memphis, they heard the real thing. They witnessed the source. And they understood, even if they couldn't explain it, that what made Robert Johnson extraordinary wasn't just skill or practice or dedication. It was something else. Something that required closed eyes to access, something that cost tears to release, something that cast shadows, that moved independently of their source. In 1961, a folklore student from the University of Mississippi managed to track down and interview 12 of the surviving passengers from that train ride. The accounts varied in details, but aligned in the essentials. A man got on the train carrying a guitar. He played for about 45 minutes with his eyes closed the entire time. He cried while he played, though he showed no other emotion. His playing was unlike anything anyone had heard before or would hear again. And when he opened his eyes at the end, something about them was different, just for a moment, just long enough to notice, just long enough to never forget. The folklore student, a young woman named Patricia Green, wrote in her thesis, "The witnesses to this event describe it with a consistency that suggests genuine experience rather than shared mythology. But more intriguing is what they don't say. When pressed for details, when asked to elaborate on specific moments, they become vague, almost evasive. It's not that they don't remember. It's that they remember too well. They remember things they can't or won't articulate, things that exist outside the boundaries of normal discourse." One subject said to me, "You want me to tell you what happened? Fine. Magic happened. Real magic. The kind that costs something. And we all paid a little bit of the price just by watching." When I asked what he meant, he just shook his head and said, "If you have to ask, you weren't there." By 1968, when Thomas Crawford gave his detailed interview, he was an old man by blues standards, worn down by decades of hard living and harder playing. He had developed arthritis in his hands, could barely hold a guitar anymore. The interviewer, a young man from a music magazine, asked him if he regretted pursuing music, given how it had treated him. Thomas laughed, a sound like dry leaves. "Regret," he said. "Son, the only thing I regret is asking Robert Johnson to play that night, because after I heard him, after I saw what real mastery looked like, I knew I'd never measure up. I spent 40 years chasing something I saw for 45 minutes on a train, and I never got close, not even close, but I had to try." Because once you've seen the summit, once you know how high the mountain goes, you can't pretend anymore. You can't be satisfied with the foothills, even if the climb kills you. There's a photograph of Robert Johnson, one of only 2 confirmed photographs that exist. In it, he's holding a guitar, wearing a suit, looking at the camera with an expression that's hard to read. Confident, maybe. Sad, definitely. Knowing, absolutely. His eyes in that photograph have been described in many ways: soulful, haunted, empty, infinite. Look at them long enough, and you start to understand what the passengers on that train saw when he finally opened his eyes. You see someone who knows things, someone who's been places, someone who paid a price that can't be calculated in money or time or anything tangible. Someone who closed his eyes, not to focus on the music, but to shut out something else. Something that was always watching, always waiting, always collecting. The third car of that train doesn't exist anymore. The specific car, I mean. It was retired, scrapped, melted down, and turned into something else. But trains still run that route, Clarksdale to Memphis, carrying passengers through the Mississippi night. And sometimes, late at night, when the rain is coming down hard and the world outside is nothing but darkness and water, conductors and passengers report hearing something. Faint, almost impossible to distinguish from the rattle of the rails, but there, definite, the sound of a guitar playing in the dark, playing with a virtuosity that seems impossible, playing with an intensity that makes people uncomfortable without quite knowing why. And if you listen closely, if you really pay attention, you can hear something else underneath the guitar, a voice, singing about crossroads and hellhounds and kitchens you'd be better off not entering, singing with a sadness that goes deeper than the blues, deeper than heartbreak, deeper than anything that has a name, singing the way someone might sing if they were trying to warn you, trying to tell you that some roads lead to places you can never come back from, that some doors, once opened, can never be fully closed, that some deals, once made, define you forever. The people who hear it usually dismiss it, blame it on the rain, on the rattling of old infrastructure, on their own tired minds playing tricks in the small hours. But sometimes, very rarely, someone will hear it and recognize it, will hear that guitar and that voice and know with absolute certainty what they're listening to. And those people, if they're wise, they close their eyes. Not to focus, not to appreciate the music, but because some things, some presences, some echoes of deals made long ago are better experienced in darkness, are better witnessed without seeing, are better felt than observed. Robert Johnson played on a train in February 1937, and 30 people watched him do it with his eyes closed. That's the simple version. The version you can say out loud without people looking at you funny. But if you want the real version, the true version, you have to understand that what those 30 people witnessed wasn't a performance. It was a confession. It was a demonstration. It was proof that the legends were true, or at least truer than anyone wanted to believe. It was evidence that when you make certain kinds of deals, when you open yourself to certain kinds of power, you don't control it. It controls you. And the only mercy, the only small grace, is that you can close your eyes while it's happening. You can shut out the sight of what you've become, even if you can't escape the sound of what you're playing. Before the train pulled into Memphis that night, before Robert Johnson disappeared into the darkness, with his guitar and his burden and his gift that was also a curse, one more thing happened. A child, maybe 7 or 8 years old, who had been sleeping in his mother's arms for most of the performance, woke up. He looked at Robert with the clarity that children sometimes have, the ability to see things adults have learned to ignore. And he asked, in a voice loud enough for several people to hear, "Mama, why is that man crying while he sleeps?" His mother shushed him, tried to get him to go back to sleep, but the boy persisted. "Mama, he's asleep, but he's playing music. Why is he crying while he sleeps?" Robert Johnson heard. How could he not? His eyes were still closed, tears still making silent tracks down his face, fingers still moving across strings. But he heard, and for just a moment, his playing faltered. Just one note, one slight hesitation. Then he recovered, finished the song, opened his eyes and looked at that child. The boy met his gaze without fear, with only curiosity. And Robert smiled. It was the only smile anyone on that train saw from him all night. A small, sad, knowing smile. "Smart boy," he said quietly. "Smarter than he knows." Then to the child's mother, "Keep him away from crossroads, you hear me? Keep him away from crossroads and midnight bargains and anyone who offers to teach him things that seem too good to be true. Because they are. They always are." Maybe the truest thing we can say about Robert Johnson is this: he was a man who learned to play guitar better than almost anyone before or since. And it cost him everything. His peace, his safety, his life. maybe even his soul, depending on what you believe. But he played. God, how he played. With his eyes closed, with tears on his face, with shadows that moved wrong, and a burden that crushed him, and a gift that elevated him, he played. And for 45 minutes on a train car in 1937, 30 witnesses got to hear what genius sounds like when it's been purchased at the highest possible price. They got to see what it looks like when talent crosses over into something else. Something transcendent and terrible. Something beautiful and damned. If you found this story unsettling, if it made you wonder about the cost of greatness, if it made you think twice about what you'd be willing to pay for your own dreams, then you've understood something true. Leave a like and subscribe to Soul Chronicles, because we're not done telling these stories. We're not done digging into the dark corners where music and myth and mystery all meet. Every soul has a song, and some of those songs are written in the shadows, played with closed eyes, witnessed by those who never forget what they saw. The train reached Memphis. Robert Johnson stepped off into the night. 30 passengers carried forward the memory of what they'd witnessed. And somewhere in the space between the rails and the rain, between the darkness and the music, between what was seen and what was felt, the truth remains. Close your eyes, listen closely, and maybe, just maybe, you'll hear it too. The sound of a guitar playing in the dark. The voice of a man who sold everything to play like an angel. The echo of a performance that 30 people watched, transfixed and terrified, as Robert Johnson played with his eyes closed. Forever closed. As if he was looking at something the rest of us can never see. As if he was seeing the price over and over again. As if he was paying it with every note.